today during this hearing in an exchange with one of my colleagues related to concern about the Affordable Care Act, you were characterized as the President's legal advisor. Do you recall that characterization?
I think so, yeah.
I think it's an erroneous characterization. Now, let me ask you a question about that. Are you familiar with the title of White House counsel, Mr. General?
Yeah, I've heard that.
And would you agree that the White House counsel is actually the President's legal advisor in the constitutional system that we have created in America?
Yeah, you got to understand, as questions get fired at you, you can't push back with regard to everything that's contained in a question. But you're right. I'm not the President's legal advisor. I'm the Attorney General of the United States, and there's a fundamental difference. The White House counsel is, in fact, the President's legal advisor.
Thank you, Mr. General. Now, the characterization was also brought up earlier today, suggestive of the fact that under your leadership, the Department of Justice has somehow engaged in prosecutorial decisions based on race and/or party affiliation. Do you recall that suggestion?
Yes.
Now, my colleague, distinguished colleague from New Orleans, recently raised the question of the matter in Washington, D.C., related to a mayoral candidate who, in fact, lost the election after perhaps being linked to Justice Department activity. Was that current mayor a Democrat, Mr. General?
Yes.
And he's a black Democrat, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, I also believe that the mayor of Charlotte was recently indicted. Is that correct, by the Department of Justice?
That's correct.
And was he a Democratic mayor, Mr. General?
I believe he is.
Okay. And he's African American as well, is that correct?
He is.
So I think that the suggestions related to your Department of Justice, and there are a myriad of examples, but I've got limited time, are really irresponsible, reckless, and not evidence-based. And I think this committee would be well served by staying within the four corners of the actual facts that are before us. I've got limited time, so I want to deal with the gun violence issue. It's one that affects the district that I represent in Brooklyn. I think we have a gun violence problem, in fact, in America. 5% of the world's population, 50% of the world's guns, more than 14,000 Americans who've died as a result of gun violence since the tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut. Now, we've got a legislative track, which unfortunately has been barren of activity, and then there's an administrative executive track. The President, in January of 2013, announced a series of initiatives, some of which he charged the Justice Department with engaging in, and I want to just explore where we're at in terms of that activity. It's my understanding that the President directed the Attorney General to review the categories of individuals prohibited from having a gun to make sure that dangerous individuals are not possessing weapons that can do harm. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, this is a real concern for communities that I represent. We have tough gun control laws in New York State. A lot of the guns come from the neighboring state of Pennsylvania. Chicago famously has a lot of gun violence problems. A lot of their laws, guns come from the neighboring state of Indiana. South Central Los Angeles has got some gun violence problems. A lot of their guns come from the neighboring state of Arizona. That's why the Justice Department engagement is so significant. Where do things stand in terms of that review that the President charged the Department of Justice with in January of 2013?
I don't remember exact number. I think there were 17 or 21 things that came out of the review that the President asked us to review, and I think that we have now completed all of the things that the President asked us to do, which I think was as far as we could go using only the executive power that we had. There is still a need, I think, for legislation to deal with the common sense measures that would help deal with the gun violence problem in this country. We have tried to do what we could with regard to enhanced background checks, but there is still the need, and there is still the need to close, for instance, the gun show loophole, to deal with the problem of assault weapons, to deal also with the problem of these large clips. These are things that, again, are overwhelmingly supported by the American people, make sense, and would keep the American people safer.
Mr. General, I agree that there's an absolute need for congressional action, but let me also say that in the interim, I think it's important, and I'd like to be able to work closely with the Department of Justice, the ATF, to deal with some of the on-the-ground problems that we have in America today, short of legislative action, because the children that I represent, some of whom are dying on the streets of Brooklyn from illegal guns from other parts of the country, can't afford for us to wait for congressional action. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman from New York yields back. The gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chavis, is now recognized.